Ireland's oldest city was not built by kings or bishops. It was built by raiders, men who crossed cold seas in open ships, found a sheltered river, estuary, on the southeast coast of Ireland and decided to stay. From that moment in 914, Waterford began a journey that no one could have predicted. It would become a Viking powerhouse, a Norman stronghold, Ireland's second city for 5 centuries, the birthplace of the Irish flag, and the home of the most famous crystal in the world. This is the full story of Waterford, from its violent origins to the city it is today. Before we begin, a quick note. This video uses artificial intelligence to visually reconstruct Waterford across the centuries. Some visual details may not be perfect, but our goal is simple: to bring this extraordinary city back to life. In 914, a large Norse fleet entered Waterford harbour. These were not the first Norsemen to arrive on this coast. Viking activity had been recorded in the area as early as 860. But this fleet was different. It was led by a grandson of the legendary Viking ruler known as Ivar the Boneless, and it came not just to raid, but to establish. The fragmentary annals of Ireland record the event plainly. A great fleet of Norwegians landed at the place the Irish had long called their own, plundered the surrounding territory, and returned to their ships laden with cattle and livestock. The location was not chosen at random. The River Suir provided deep, navigable water. The surrounding river network, 3 major rivers converging nearby, opened a highway into the fertile interior of Ireland. The sheltered estuary offered protection from the violent storms of the Irish Sea. The Norse gave it a name meaning roughly the fjord of the Rams or the windy fjord, a practical name for a practical people. A few kilometres upriver from where the city would grow, archaeologists discovered in 2003 the remains of an earlier Viking settlement at a place now called Woodstown. Established in the mid to late 800s, it was likely one of the largest Viking settlements outside Scandinavia during that period. The finds there tell a story of extraordinary reach: amber from the Baltic, coins from Iraq and Samarkand, weapons from Scandinavia, and a richly furnished warrior grave containing a sword, spear, axe and shield. Raiders who already carried the world in their cargo. The camp became a town. Archaeological excavations carried out in the 1980s revealed that by the mid-11th century, Waterford was already a densely settled urban centre. The town was defended by a substantial ditch, in places more than 8 metres wide and 2.5 metres deep, with a large stone wall beyond it. Inside, 2 main streets ran through the settlement, roughly where Peter Street and High Street stand today. Peter Street was paved with tightly packed small stones and measured more than 2.5 metres across. The houses were built in the Norse manner, 3-aisled structures with clay floors and woven wattle walls. On some sites, excavators found at least 7 generations of houses built on top of one another between the 11th and mid-12th century. Families lived, rebuilt and lived again on the same ground for over 100 years. Among the finds from these layers, a kite-shaped brooch decorated with gold filigree, imported pottery from southern England and northwestern France, bone combs and the timbers of ships. At the heart of the Norse settlement stood a tower guarding the harbour entrance. It is mentioned in the Irish annals as early as 1088, making it the oldest civic structure on the island of Ireland. The Vikings called their settlement a long fort, a ship fortress. Over time it became something more, a city. The Vikings of Waterford did not exist apart from Ireland. They inserted themselves into it. The kings of Waterford, descendants of the dynasty founded by Ivar the Boneless, fought, traded, married and schemed alongside the great Irish kings of Munster and Leinster. In 984, the most powerful Irish ruler of his age allied himself with Waterford's Norse fleet against Dublin. Waterford was not merely a target, it was a partner. When Brian Boru consolidated his grip on Ireland and moved toward the High Kingship, the Norse city of Waterford supported his rise. The battle fought outside Dublin on Good Friday in the year 1014 brought together armies from across Ireland and beyond. Waterford was not among those who opposed Brian at Clontarf. His enemies were the Dublin Vikings, the King of Leinster, and mercenaries from Orkney and the Isle of Man. Brian won. He died in his tent the same afternoon, killed after the battle was already decided. His descendants, the O'Brien dynasty, would remain the dominant power in Munster, and Waterford, bound to them through decades of alliance, continued to prosper in their shadow. If you want to help this channel keep going, you can become a member and support the work directly. Every contribution helps us rebuild more of the past. The link is in the description below. The Vikings of Waterford did not remain pagan for long. As the 10th century wore on, Norse settlers across Ireland began to adopt Christianity, intermarrying with Irish families and absorbing the faith of the island around them. At Waterford, the first Norse church, dedicated to St. Olaf, was built possibly as early as the 990s. A second church, dedicated to the Holy Trinity, was built on the site of what is now the cathedral around the year 1050. In 1096, Waterford took a further step toward integration with the wider Christian world. A Benedictine monk from Winchester Abbey in England was consecrated as the first bishop of Waterford in Canterbury. The city had become a diocese, its Norse community now fully part of the institutional church. In 1111, at a great church council held in the Irish Midlands, the links between Waterford and Canterbury were formally dissolved. Waterford was incorporated into the structure of the Irish Church. The Norse city was becoming an Irish one. By the early 12th century, Waterford was a Christian, literate, commercially powerful town of hybrid identity, neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Gaelic, speaking Norse and Irish, trading with England and France, connected to the church networks of both islands. It was a remarkable thing to have grown from a raiders' camp in less than 200 years. The world around Waterford was changing. In 1137, the King of Leinster attempted to seize the city and failed. The Norse defenders held. Waterford had resisted every threat for over 2 centuries, and its walls and its people had never been broken. But the threat that would end the Viking age of Waterford came not from an Irish king, it came from across the sea. In 1169, a group of armoured horsemen from Wales landed on the coast of Wexford at the invitation of a dispossessed Irish king. They were unlike anything the Norse settlers of Waterford had faced before. They fought in disciplined formations behind walls of shields, with cavalry, with siege equipment. They had been sent by a Norman earl the Irish would come to know simply as Strongbow. In 1170, Strongbow and his ally, the deposed King of Leinster, turned their forces toward Waterford. The city that had never fallen fought hard. It took 3 assaults before the walls were breached. When they finally gave way, the Viking age of Waterford ended. The longest surviving Norse city in Ireland had held out for 256 years. What the Normans found when they entered Waterford in 1170 was not a primitive camp, but a sophisticated city. Paved streets, stone defences, a cathedral, a harbour busy with trade, a population that had lived, prayed, fought and built on this ground for generations. In the tower at the harbour's edge, the Norman lord, who had just conquered the city, married the daughter of the Irish king who had invited him. It was a political union designed to seal an alliance and legitimise a conquest. Waterford was the stage on which the future of Ireland would begin to be written. The Norse community did not vanish. Pushed from their city, some settled in the surrounding countryside. Their streets, their tower, their cathedral foundations, their harbour, all remained. The city they had built from nothing would go on to outlast every power that ever tried to claim it. Urbs intacta, the city that remains intact. Waterford had earned that name before the Normans ever arrived. Now a new chapter was about to begin. In August 1170, a city that had stood for over 2.5 centuries was about to fall for the first time. Waterford was a fortress city. Its triangular walls, deep defensive ditches, and the great stone tower at the apex of the harbour had beaten back every army that ever came against it, including an Irish king who tried to take it just 30 years earlier. But the Normans were different. Strongbow, a Welsh Norman lord named Richard de Clare, had struck a deal with that same exiled Irish king. Bring soldiers, take back my kingdom, marry my daughter, inherit my lands. His advance force arrived in the summer of 1170 at a headland south of the city. The warriors of Waterford marched out to destroy them. Around 500 men died. It was the first sign that something unprecedented had arrived. On the 23rd of August, Strongbow landed with his full army. The city resisted. The first assault failed. The second failed. On the third, his soldiers found a weakness in the outer defences and broke through. The streets were taken in hours. Amid the ruins, a wedding was held. Strongbow married the Irish princess at Christchurch Cathedral. Within a year, the first king of England ever to set foot on Irish soil landed at that same harbour, not to celebrate, but to contain. Henry II declared Waterford a royal city. Its trade, its harbour, its future, all now belonging to the English crown. The Viking City was gone, the royal city had begun. Once the crown claimed Waterford, the city prospered like never before. In 1215, King John granted it its first royal charter, giving its merchants exclusive rights over the harbour. What followed was 2 centuries of commercial dominance. Ships arrived loaded with wine from Bordeaux and left carrying wool, hides and cattle. Waterford imported more wine than any other port in Ireland, and what came in on those ships financed everything else. Italian bankers from Lombardy arrived to supervise the taxes on wool exports introduced by Edward I in 1275, funding his wars against Scotland. Their name stuck. For 2 centuries, some of the city's most powerful mayors carried the surname Lombard. The city's great rival was the nearby port of New Ross, built upriver by the descendants of Strongbow and the Irish princess. The 2 ports fought each other for generations, sometimes in the courts of England, sometimes in outright river battles. In 1266, 2 men died in one such clash on the river. In 1373, with the Black Death still casting its shadow over trade, Waterford's merchants produced their ultimate weapon, a 4-metre roll of illustrated parchment, the Great Charter Roll, carried to the court of the king to prove their ancient rights. It worked. Waterford kept its monopoly. The Black Death arrived in Ireland in 1347. In a city built on trade and crowded streets, the plague was devastating. Population fell, ships stopped coming. The quays went quiet. But Waterford recovered, and by the 15th century it had become something else entirely, the city that refused to bend. In 1487, a pretender to the English throne attempted to use Ireland as a launchpad for invasion. Waterford refused to recognise him. 8 years later, another claimant arrived with 11 ships and an army, sailing up the river to bombard the city walls into submission. The defenders flooded the marshes east of the city, stranding his fleet in the mud. Cannons mounted on Reginald's Tower opened fire. 2 of his ships went down. After 11 days, the pretender retreated. It was the first recorded use of artillery by an Irish city. A grateful King Henry VII rewarded Waterford with words that would define it forever. The city of Waterford remains untaken. The Reformation changed everything in England. In Waterford it changed almost nothing. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the city's merchants kept their faith. When Protestant queens and kings demanded conformity, Waterford's population quietly refused. The city became the most defiantly Catholic urban centre in Ireland, a place where the old religion survived not through rebellion, but through sheer, stubborn persistence. By 1642, with Ireland convulsed by rebellion, Waterford became one of the founding pillars of the Confederation of Kilkenny, a Catholic government that controlled 2/3 of the island and functioned for 7 extraordinary years as a de facto independent Irish state. Waterford contributed its port, its wealth and its loyalty. It could not last. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell arrived in Ireland with an army that had just executed a king. He came to Waterford's walls, and for the first time in the city's history, its name felt fragile. In the autumn of 1649, Waterford heard what had happened at Drogheda and Wexford. Cromwell's army had stormed both towns, the garrisons had been put to the sword. The city braced itself. Cromwell arrived at the walls on the 24th of November. He sent the mayor a letter demanding surrender, signed with some irony, "Your loving friend." The city refused. But the Irish winter refused on his behalf. Rain turned the roads to mud, making it impossible to move his heavy artillery into range. Disease tore through his army. Out of 6,500 soldiers, barely 3,000 were still fit to fight by December. His commander died of sickness in the field. On the 2nd of December, Cromwell abandoned the siege and withdrew. He never came back. But his son-in-law did. In the summer of 1650, Henry Ireton returned with a naval blockade sealing the port and artillery, advancing through trenches toward the walls. Inside, the plague was already killing up to 400 people a week. The garrison was down to 700 fit soldiers and 500 pounds of gunpowder. On the 6th of August, the city surrendered. Ireton's soldiers moved through the cathedral, melting down gold and silver chalices. They stripped the organ pipes from their mounts, carried them down to the quay, and cut them up for scrap. But they never found everything. Beneath the cathedral floor, locked in iron chests, lay the only complete set of medieval vestments to survive in Northern Europe, hidden by hands whose names we will never know, and left there undisturbed for 123 years. Waterford had fallen. For the first time in its 700-year history, the city was in the hands of an occupying army. But cities endure, and Waterford, more than most, had learned how. The name that had defined it for a century and a half, the untaken city, had not been wrong. It had been early. Waterford had held longer than almost anywhere else. It had been the last major Catholic stronghold to fall in the east of Ireland. When the soldiers finally left and the city began to rebuild, it carried something no conquest could touch. 1,000 years of layered history beneath its streets, in its stones, in its walls. Viking, Norman, medieval, Catholic, each era absorbed into the next, each refusing to be entirely erased. The story told in this video ends here, in the ruins of 1650. But Waterford's story does not. In part 3, we'll follow the city into its Georgian Renaissance, the birth of Crystal, the Famine, the birth of the Irish flag, and the street battles of 1922 that helped decide what kind of country Ireland would become. Waterford emerged from the wreckage of 1650 slowly. For decades it remained a city under restraint, its Catholic merchants taxed, its churches converted, its civic life hollowed out. But cities rebuild. And by the early 18th century, something unexpected was happening on the banks of the River Suir. The medieval walls that had defined Waterford for 5 centuries were pulled down at the start of the 1700s. In their place rose a new city, wider streets, Georgian terraces, a mall lined with limestone. Catholic, Anglican, Quaker and HYU Gounod families rebuilt Waterford together, each community contributing to a prosperity that transcended religious division. One man shaped the skyline more than any other. Born in Waterford in 1712, the architect who would define the city's Georgian character had the unusual distinction of designing both its Protestant and Catholic cathedrals. His Protestant cathedral was described by one architectural historian as the finest 18th century ecclesiastical building in Ireland. His Catholic cathedral, the first post-Reformation Catholic cathedral built in Ireland, was still under construction when he died in 1796, having risen too early one morning to inspect the work and fallen asleep on the unfinished floor, catching a chill from which he never recovered. By the time he died, he had transformed a medieval city into a European one. In 1783, the same year that construction began on that Catholic cathedral, 2 Quaker merchants standing beside the River Suir had a different kind of vision. They wanted to make the finest glass in Europe. They petitioned Parliament for aid, invested £10,000 and built a glass house on Merchants Quay. They recruited skilled craftsmen from England, set them to work with lead and fire and patience, and within a year were producing crystal of such clarity and brilliance that it found its way to the tables of kings. Waterford glass reached the courts of Europe, the markets of America, and the homes of the wealthy across the world. But the industry that had made the city's name was never safe. Excise taxes on Irish glass, introduced in the early 19th century, slowly strangled it. By 1851, after 68 years of continuous production, the glasshouse closed. The craftsmen scattered, the moulds went cold. For nearly a century, Waterford Crystal was a memory. The Great Famine arrived in Ireland in 1845. In Waterford, as across the country, the potato crop failed, and then failed again. the county's population fell from nearly 200,000 to under 160,000 in a decade. The workhouses at Waterford and Dungarvan were overwhelmed. Ships left the quay carrying people who would never return. But Waterford in the 1840s also gave Ireland something that would outlast the famine. A young man born on the Mall, the son of a wealthy Catholic merchant, had travelled to Paris and returned carrying a gift: 3 lengths of French silk in green, white and orange. On the 7th of March 1848, he stood in the city of his birth and raised that flag for the first time in public. He described the white in the centre as a lasting truce between the orange and the green. The flag did not become Ireland's national symbol for another 90 years, but it began here, on the quays of Waterford. That same young man was later transported for his part in the failed rebellion of 1848. He escaped to America, became a general in the Union Army during the Civil War, and died as the acting governor of Montana Territory. His city never forgot him. The decades that followed the famine were decades of slow pressure. The Land League, the fight for tenant rights, the long campaign for Home Rule, that consumed a generation of Irish political life. Waterford sent its voices to Westminster and its men to the fields. When the War of Independence finally broke out in 1919, Waterford's flying column was in the field under a commander from West Waterford. Ambushes on British patrols, attacks on barracks. Martial law declared across the county in January 1921. When the truce came in July 1921 and the treaty was signed in December, Waterford's British garrison packed its weapons and left. But the treaty divided Ireland as surely as any invasion. Waterford became a stronghold of the anti-treaty side, the eastern pillar of what Republicans called the Munster Republic. In July 1922, Free State troops arrived from Kilkenny with an 18-pound artillery piece. They placed it on the hill north of the river, overlooking the city that had once repelled every army that came against it. The shells fell on the barracks and the jail. Within days, Waterford fell to Irishmen firing on Irishmen. For the first time since Cromwell, artillery had decided the city's fate. Europe in 1947 was still pulling itself from the ruins of a Second World War. In Waterford, a Czech glassmaker who had fled the communist takeover of his country arrived with a mission: to rebuild what had been lost nearly a century before. He had studied the old pattern books preserved in the National Museum in Dublin. He brought with him a fellow craftsman as chief designer. Together they built a small factory in the suburbs of the city and began again. The first glass was blown in September 1947. Within a decade, Waterford Crystal was not just alive, it was dominant. By the 1970s, the factory employed 3,000 people in a city of 46,000. Its chandeliers hung in Westminster Abbey, Windsor Castle, and the Kennedy Centre in Washington. The Lismore pattern, designed in 1952, its diamond cuts inspired by the towers of a castle in County Waterford, became the world's best-selling crystal stemware. In 1999, more than 1 billion people watched a Waterford crystal ball descend over Times Square to mark the new millennium. The factory closed again in 2009, a casualty of the global financial crisis. It reopened the following year in the heart of the city, closer to the quay where the Penrose brothers had first fired their furnaces 226 years before. Waterford today is Ireland's oldest city. Its Viking streets still run below the Georgian facades. Reginald's Tower still stands at the edge of the quay 1,000 years after the first stone was laid. The medieval vestments hidden beneath the cathedral floor in 1650 are on display in the museum 2 minutes' walk from where they were buried. The city has been taken twice in its history, by Strongbow in 1170 and by Irishmen in 1922. Every other army that came left empty-handed. The city of Waterford remains.